Hey, deserving listeners. So in my timeline, tomorrow is the day that the wedding episode comes out. So I don't know the results of the weddings, but I was totally obsessing about a few different points in this show that I wanted to review, particularly the moments where Jackie talks about whether or not she met up with Josh before breaking up with Marshall or not. So I wanted to rewatch just those scenes. I know that last season I rewatched the entire season again. I created a bunch of, I would imagine, somewhat boring videos of me rewatching and reacting to the show, but the season was just so interesting. And this one perhaps is even more interesting. But I do want to review some other key moments, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. But I want to particularly review some of the moments with Jackie and Marshall. So let's get to it.
For me, I think I feed really hard off people's energy. I would kind of maybe consider myself like an empath. So it's important to surround myself with really genuine people.
Okay, I couldn't help but as I was reviewing, looking for the clips, landing on some of these clips that I feel like I just want to comment on a little bit if you'll indulge me. And very briefly, I would say that it's possible that that statement is reflective of a larger personality trait for Micah, in which when she's around people who are positive and pro-social, then she will be positive and pro-social. And when she's with other sorts of people, she will act and be and feel like other sorts of people. There's evidence of that on the show. We don't know, of course.
I would be a good mom, but I just don't want to raise my kid too hard, you feel me?
Yes.
That's one thing about me. I was raised strict as shit, and I'm I don't want to raise my kid too strict to where my kid feels like he can't trust me, because there's a lot of things I don't tell my parents because I feel like my parents are so hard, you know?
Knowing what we know at the end, and I promise I'm not going to do what I did last season and just watch the entire season. I feel compelled to do that, but I think people were bored with that, which I totally understand. But it's interesting to see this in light of what we have heard from Jackie on the show and off the show. I think Jackie claims that everything was fine in her family, or at the very least pushes back on any kind of implication that she was abused growing up or went through difficulties, which she has the right to do. Even if it's not true, she has the right to say, look, y'all, you don't know shit about my family, and shut up. Stop speculating. I mean, the way that people talk, they will say things like they absolutely know that this happened, and they might even go after her parents if they find her parents online and abuse them. I mean, people, it's totally out of control. And I think it has been for a while, and it took a while for me to notice it or be emphasizing of it, since I went through it last year myself to a lesser extent. But anyway, so Jackie is now saying that she had stern parents and she doesn't want to be that kind of parent growing up. And she says, because I want my kid to trust me. I think that implies that she doesn't trust her parents. She says even today that her parents just don't accept things about her. And yeah, that'll do a number on you. So when we go through difficulties, and listen to all my deep dives on schema therapy, they're mostly just for patrons, but schema therapy I thought was interesting when I first learned it, but the more and more I live life and treat clients, the more and more I find myself going to schema therapy as at least the beginning of a conceptualization. Of course, for me, there's a wide variety of theories that I go to, and a lot of it psychodynamic, a lot of it systems, a lot of it cognitive, a lot of it neurological. Anyway, but in general, when we go through difficulties, we develop what they call a maladaptive schema, which means that we have a belief system that is arguably neurological, meaning that it's not just something we decide, it becomes kind of our physical brain basis for how to interpret the world that is reflective of the way we're being treated. So if you're treated in a stern way, you start to develop these ideas of who you are and who other people are that might be not healthy, right? That might be a result of the unhealthy environment you're going through. Your needs aren't being met. And so when a child is being treated in a stern way, the message often to a child is you're not acceptable and that you're not good enough. And your emotions, particularly vulnerability, because children that are being treated sternly will often cry and exhibit vulnerability as a signal to the parents of please don't do this to me. And if the parents don't attune to that and respond, then the child ends up learning that their emotions and their vulnerability are not good. They are unacceptable. They are being punished, or they are being treated badly because of their vulnerability. They might learn to hate their vulnerability because that's when sadness emerges, or they're being called weak, or maybe that's when they particularly become rejected or something. And so you develop these ideas, very firm belief systems, reflective of that experience. You also have a schema about other people. You start to believe that other people can't be trusted, or other people don't really like you. You can develop a schema of defectiveness that basically at the core, you believe that no one would really like you if they really knew you. So when you have that maladaptive schema, then it is to some extent fixed in place. Now, you can change it with a lot of other sorts of experiences that counter that, and particularly going to therapy and identifying it for self-awareness, and also trying to have corrective experiences to correct for that experience, and list all my deep dives on that. But the point is that in the interim, before you have an opportunity to change it, and maybe that's the rest of your life, you have 3 styles, according to the model of schema therapy, in terms of dealing with that maladaptive schema. You can surrender, you can avoid, or you can overcompensate. To surrender to that schema, because the schema is inside of you. It starts from outside, it's an experiential thing, and then eventually the schema now resides inside the person and goes with them wherever they are in every relationship, in every situation, regardless of evidence. You know, they might be treated in a certain way at home with their parents, and then they emerge into adulthood and they just assume that everyone is just like their parents and that everyone will see them just like their parents saw them, even though that's not necessarily the case, of course. Anyway, so to surrender to the various different kinds of schemas that can result from having a stern parent that creates distrust is that you can say, well, I'm worthless, or I'm a bad person, and I'm just going to sabotage my life and myself because what's the use? I might as well just lean into it. I'm a loser, or I'm a screw up, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of different manifestations, a lot of different subtypes of that. The avoidance style is, as opposed to surrendering, is to just perhaps avoid relationships, avoid situations where sternness might be elicited from other people. There are fewer subsets in the avoidance category, but it's a frequent one. You can also avoid by drinking, you can avoid by not having relationships, that sort of thing. Then the third style is to overcompensate. And it's possible that Jackie is a candidate of overcompensation for the maladaptive schema, of which I have no idea if it exists or not. The overcompensation style is to say, well, okay, so I'm being treated in a stern way, and I'm not being valued for my vulnerable emotions, and I think that I matter, but I'm being treated like I don't, so I must not matter, and I can't trust other people. So you know what? Screw it. I'm going to actually become the stern person. I'm going to become the harsh, hard individual. Because if I go against my nature, if I swing the other way, with the pendulum, meaning I swing away from vulnerability and towards cold, harsh, callous, unfeeling, unempathetic mode, if I'm in that state, then I don't have to, 1, deal with my negative emotions, even though you do, and 2, I'm also identifying with people that are doing this to me. And this is all established when you're young, when you're like 5 to 10 years old. And so if I become like the stern people, then maybe I'll get more acceptance. At the very least, I won't have to acknowledge my vulnerable emotions because no one cares about them anyway. And so there's a possibility that happened to her. Of course, I really don't want to put that out there. Don't go to Jackie's page and say, Dr. Kirk Honda said that you're overcome. Like, please, understand that I have no idea. The only reason why I'm putting any of this out there is for you to think about yourself. And also for you clinicians to have potentially a continuing education element of this theory.
Keep in mind I'm a kid, right? He would say, you're gonna be on the side of the road begging for change, and I'm not gonna stop to give you any.
Oh no.
And
oh, honey.
It is notable that Jackie is really taking care of Marshall in this moment. I'm often looking for that reciprocity and that capability for Jackie. And of course, we're only seeing little snippets. So either this is representative of a lot of things that happened away from what was being shown to us, or it's just an anomaly But I don't know. I suspect that Jackie does have a heart, a big heart, and can care for Marshall because of that dynamic of the overfunctioner, underfunctioner that I kept talking about with them. Whenever I see Jackie of that reversal, because it's about flexibility, right? Because we all have different needs at different moments. And Marshall now has a need to be vulnerable and be taken care of. And he's not only saying a lot of things and having a vibe that is actually someone that's saying, this is hard for me, and I, not necessarily what we would call an over-functioning role, but at the very least that he's offering up the chance to be taken care of. And this is something for you to think about. There's a thing called avoidant attachment or codependency that can result in people never really giving off the vibe that they need help. People, there are 3 different stages to this dimension of this problem. The first stage is that the person will say, I don't have needs and I'm okay. The second stage is they will realize, wait, I think I do have needs, and how come no one is taking care of me? Okay. And the third stage is I do have needs and I need to actually participate in the eliciting of other people taking care of me in a very real, scary, vulnerable way. These sorts of individuals have a really hard time with vulnerability. You can talk vulnerably, but to be vulnerable is actually very hard because of their early childhood experiences. So that middle phase is, I think I have needs, and some of you might be in this category. You think, I think I have needs, but how come no one ever takes care of me? And it'll feel very hurtful because it's a transference from when we're children that was the case, that the child was being overtly vulnerable and trying to elicit care, but more often than not, or enough of the time, the child was not being attuned to or responded to. And then you shut down and you say, I don't have feelings. But then over time it gets too much, or you go to therapy or you listen to this channel and you're like, wait, maybe I do have vulnerability. And then you say, okay, I'm going to actually try to get my needs met. But because you're not used to actually the way that Marshall is right now, just embodying vulnerability, there's a vibe, there's an open trust that you have and a familiarity with being vulnerable, with crying, with talking in a certain way. This middle phase avoidant or codependent person, and avoidant people aren't always codependent. I'm just using those words as a stand-in for a lot of different things. But for these individuals, they will say, for example, hey, I have a lot of needs. I need you to take care of me. But they'll be more matter of fact. They'll be more angry about it. They won't actually be vulnerable. And the thing that I always will work with people in this stage is I will push them to actually cry in front of the person that they're trying to elicit care from. And they'll say, well, I have a really hard time with that. And I'll say, yeah, I get it, and we'll work on it. But that's at least one of the paths. There are other ways of being in your body and being trusting of other people as we are vulnerable. But crying is often the key. Not always, but it often is the key. The key is to really be in that state of vulnerability and to allow the full expression to emit through your entire body. But it's terrifying to people with this syndrome. It's terrifying because it's like asking people to just jump off a bridge without a bungee cord, or a parachute. Just like, you're just going to have to trust me.
No, I'm crying. What you saying over there? Go stand by the thing and listen. No, but don't be obvious. Don't let them see you.
That's not what he wanted, and that's okay.
It's interesting to see that with Micah. She's the one that suggests that Irina go over there, because I think there's some ideas about who's the ringleader. And I think we have that assumption that in a situation like this, there's always a leader, there's always a ringleader, but, not necessarily, obviously. And I think in terms of what we've seen on the show, well, it does seem like Micah is the more active one. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, but I'm just like, you could have been a little bit more forthcoming about where you were at instead of just telling me what I wanted to hear, because now I feel like a fucking idiot because I believed you.
Yeah. The fact that Irina is having uncontrollable laughter. It's one thing to smirk and smile. It's another thing to be suppressing an uncontrollable urge to laugh at Amber, right, was her name? I'm just trying to understand what would be the impulse there. Why would you be that way? And, I'm always trying to relate. I'm always trying to see like, okay, how can I relate to this? And the only thing I can really go to for myself is when I was in the 7th grade. I have my yearbooks behind me. One of my shelves, I have my junior high and high school yearbooks. One notable thing is that in the 7th grade, I went through, and this is the end of the year, I went through the entire yearbook of my class, my classmates, my grade 7, and I wrote either nice things or mean things about a lot of people in my class. You're a cool person and you're a dork or you're stupid. I wrote it in the yearbook. This is something that I was handing out to people. Maybe I did it after I exchanged, but I was going on record in my own yearbook and writing on their face that I didn't like these people. And there was nothing, these kids didn't bully me. These kids weren't against me. I just was being a snot, being insecure, and trying to otherize, trying to, I guess, kind of bully in a sense, right? I didn't bully them in person, but I did in the yearbook. And the very next year in 8th grade, my yearbook didn't have any of that. There was none of that. But in that year, 7th grade, that's where I was. That's the amount of immaturity and insecurity that I had. That's where it all kind of came together. And it's not uncommon in 7th grade to actually have that challenge or around there somewhere. So really identifying with that inner 7th grader for me is the one place where I can possibly relate to what Micah and Irina are doing right there. It's the one theme or thread of my personality and experience, because I do remember having those kinds of motivations. It felt right. It felt okay. It felt just. It felt moral. I also just didn't really care about being responsible. I didn't feel responsible for other people's feelings. The concept just had not been integrated into my personality yet. Would be very soon, but not at that moment. When I was younger, I probably also didn't feel responsible for other people's feelings, but I wasn't nearly as insecure as I was in the 7th grade. Because in the 7th grade, for whatever reason, that's when a lot of that development socially and of the culture of my school maybe as well, where you really start trying to fit in, you really start trying to stratify yourself, like I'm cooler or that person is uncool. Am I uncool? How do I make myself cool? And how do I make myself popular or likable or something like this? And so that gives me the ability. So when I go there, I think, would that explain this behavior? That's the mode that they're in. It does make me wonder for both Irina and Micah if something happened during that phase, whether it was 7th grade or 6th grade or 8th grade or somewhere around there, where they became fixed in a state or they have a theme in their personality or they have a way of going to that place where they were bullied or ostracized or made fun of or went through some sort of trauma, such that when under stress, that's what they regress back to. That's the mindset they go back to. And there are other times when they wouldn't be that way. And I think Irina demonstrated that. I think there were times that she did not act like a 7th grader. She acted like a nice, moral adult, someone who can have compassion and feelings for other people. Micah's harder to read because when she's more relaxed and non-this mode, she doesn't seem to exhibit, at least in the edit, a lot of vulnerability. Irina does. So it's just harder to know what's going on with Micah, in my opinion.
How many times do you see her have to be broken, you know? Figures that, you know, abort.
You were with Micah?
Yeah.
It's just so awful. And this is right on the heels of Micah breaking up with Kwame, and I obviously didn't review that scene, and Kwame is just crying and crying and crying, and Micah's like, yeah, I don't know, anyway, moving on in life, and just doesn't seem to recognize what's going on. And I know I've hypothesized before that maybe they just, for whatever reason, for immaturity or ignorance, they just didn't really understand that people were here seriously, that they thought this was all a game, and they treated it as such.
I want to be nicer. I'm like not nice at all.
Why don't you then?
What?
Why don't you then?
I don't know, because I'm like feeling real emotions and it's like just like all of it's a lot, dude.
Irina's saying that it's hard for her to feel real emotions. So I think what happened is that Chelsea noticed what was happening, or other people noticed what Irina and Micah were doing to Amber, and this is a later conversation. Chelsea has that in her head as she is trying to help them to not do that, maybe trying to protect Amber or something. I don't know. I'm speculating, of course. And Chelsea is being pointed, but also not super hostile. It's like a big sister talking to someone. It's like, how come you're being this way? And then Irina says, it's just hard. She says, Irina, I want to be a better person, but it's just hard. It's overwhelming. There's a lot of emotions. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I could see that being legit. I could also see someone just saying that because they're caught, right? When you catch a child, if you're a parent, and they've done something and they're in trouble, some kids will learn that if they say certain phrases, they'll throw you off of your game so that they can avoid being disciplined or something. If you're overwhelmed, there are a lot of different ways of coping with that. Openly ridiculing someone is not a typical coping mechanism. Now, I will say that it can be. For some people, that is where you go. You just make everything into a joke, including other people's feelings. So it's possible, but it's also possible that she's just trying to say something to get people off her back.
Yeah.
It's true. It is. I heard people that talk bad about one another because they aren't cool with themselves, you know?
Right. Yeah. Chelsea is being wise, and you could either see this as her being a big sister and being pointed but helpful, or she is very subtly just roasting them.
Yeah.
This is a game, dude.
Yeah, and then Chelsea says, this isn't a game, dude. And I wonder if they saw a lot more of this sort of thing with Micah and with Irina, that in the beginning of the pod's experience, Chelsea and maybe others are thinking, do you not understand that we're all here actually seriously? And you seem to be acting like, one, you're not here seriously, and two, that no one is here. People are here seriously looking to marry someone.
It wouldn't be a thing if you didn't. So that is also making me like a little hurt by that too.
I just feel like you're mad at me.
I'm not.
She is saying, you're saying this like you're mad at me. And there wasn't any indication that he was mad. So that was a displacement. People will say that's a projection, but technically in the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic language, that's not a projection. Projection is when you project an aspect of yourself. You could argue that that could also be an example, but the way that we would describe that more typically without knowing more information is that it's a displacement or a transference, that you were treated in a way in which typically it was anger that was coming at you, and you have a bone to pick with that. You don't like that. You went through that in a legit way. And then someone else comes along and exhibits behavior that allows for the displacement. You have an issue, an unresolved anger or hurt with the person that would get angry at you too often. And then you just start seeing a lot of people as being angry at you when they're not. So that is a displacement. You're displacing the dynamic and the feelings and the reactivity from the original source, which was legit, to another source that is not legit and not reflective of what's happening. So if you ever have been told, like, how come you're so angry at me? And you legitimately know enough about your emotions to say, I'm not angry. That's a displacement. It's not a projection, technically.
I feel slighted that someone has been listening to me bare my fucking soul for days. Be a man and talk to me.
I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
Okay, head back to the lounge. Take all the time you need.
So there is a sternness to him as he's talking about Josh, and I made this argument at the time that you could say that Marshall is displacing from Josh to her. He's saying, you need to be a man and own up to your stuff with me. And you could imagine it could be slightly rational for Jackie to interpret that as aggression or anger towards her from Marshall. It's not explicit, of course, and not everyone would interpret it that way. Who knows? But if this is legit and she's actually nauseous and overwhelmed, that does point towards a lot of trauma. I don't know that, of course, but it does point to that. Also, one could argue that she's exhibiting sensitivity, which she claims she does not have or doesn't like. Now, we could imagine she doesn't like it about herself, but she seems to deny when she's talking about Marshall, because she will criticize Marshall for being sensitive, right? She will claim that she is not sensitive. Now, maybe she has a different definition of sensitive, but I would imagine a lot of people would call what she's going through right now, not in a way of insulting her, as a way of just saying you're exhibiting normal human sensitivity. But I think a lot of people would call this being sensitive, being emotional, being vulnerable, having sadness, having fear. I don't know if we know who that person is. I think that is someone that didn't make it to the next phase. I can't tell. It doesn't look like one of the people that we follow. We just see her randomly kicking a bag. Is it that's her workout? Is she getting out her frustrations? But that doesn't look like a typical workout outfit, which of course is fine. But I don't know. I just want to know what the story is behind this. It's just 2 seconds of a scene. You just imagine she's in the pods and she gets broken up with, or she's having a hard time finding someone to fall in love with, and she's just like, fuck it, I'm going to kick that bag. It just makes me wonder about all the things that happen in the pods that they don't show us, because it's 10 days. Just think of all the things that are happening.
I did not want to see Josh after that because Marshall is just the better choice for me. He's gonna help me grow. He is emotionally available. He's able to handle my spiciness, my attitude. He knows how to basically make sure that I'm feeling good and solid.
All right, it's interesting to hear these statements. Of course, a lot of people online will say that Jackie's a jerk face because originally you said you wanted Marshall because he was emotionally available and sensitive, and then you flipped the script and you broke up with him because of that. I think a lot of people do that. One, because she doesn't know how they really are going to be together in person, right? So you could appreciate someone's sensitivity and then meet him in person and just be like, oh, it's a different kind of sensitivity, or I actually am not very attracted to him, or I'm not really feeling it sexually with him, or something like that. And then the sensitivity issue just gets highlighted because you don't know what else to say or whatever. I don't know. But this does happen in relationships, and you could think for yourself. Think about a chaotic, dramatic, difficult relationship, ongoing relationship you had in your past, maybe a set of those relationships. And if you can, really try to remember, and it's not always true, but it often is, that it'll be easier for you to remember why you broke up with that person. So maybe pause the video, make a list of 5 to 10 things about that person as to why you broke up with them. And then also shift your mind to the beginning of the relationship and really try, if you can, and sometimes it's really hard because when we go through difficulties, it'll rewrite the past. But if you can, try to remember why you fell in love with them, what you liked about them, what you were attracted to them for. It's possible that the list is the same but worded differently. So with sensitivity, you might say, well, I broke up with him because he constantly wanted to talk about emotions, and he was so sensitive, and he just didn't have the strength of a person I wanted to look for, or he wasn't aggressive. He didn't have that aggression that I'm looking for, and that rejection of emotions, and that sort of animalistic vibe in bed or something. So you could say that about breaking up with someone, but on the other list of why you actually fell in love, you might actually say, well, the things that she said. He was different than my past relationships in that he talked about his emotions. He was man enough to admit that he has sadness. And he cared about me in a deep way. He expressed his care for me. And he is the sort of person that would help me to grow as a human being, as opposed to just having the same sort of relationships that I always have, which are kind of indicative with the difficult childhood I went through. So different descriptors, different adjectives, different vibes for describing the same quality in someone. So why does this happen? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but one of the conceptualizations that I use is projective identification and mutual projective identification, systemic projective identification. Listen to all my deep dives on that. It's pretty complicated, but in a nutshell, it's a psychodynamic idea that goes back over 100 years, and it's been refined over time. And I use it in a particular contemporary object relations, relational psychoanalytic sort of way. But anyway, so with projective identification, we have to start off with where it begins. And it begins in early childhood, of course, because That's where our personality is often at least given a little bit of a foundation, if not a lot of our foundation. And when we go through an experience, so say you're a young child and you're treated in a very stern manner, and there are experiences in which, and it's all perception, it's not based on objective third-party evaluation, it's based on the way the child feels and the way the child interprets things, which can be very particular to that child. So the child interprets the stern, rejecting parenting as this experience of, I'm observing the parent rejecting me, I'm observing the parent as kind of scary, I'm observing the parent as not thinking that I'm a good person, I'm observing the self as I'm not good enough, I'm weak, I have weak emotions, I'm not okay, I'm not acceptable, I'm not safe. Okay, so that whole unit of relationship of a perception of the other and a perception of the self and all the emotions and interactions associated with it becomes internalized and becomes kind of a unit. We call it an interject, or I call it an internalized relationship representation. It's a long word. Interject might be a better, shorter term. But anyway, so this unit, this relational unit, the observation of the other, the observation of the self, if repeated over time and significant enough emotionally, it will become a significant part of the personality. And I hope this makes sense as I move forward because it's pretty complicated. When I teach it to my students, it'll take me several hours of class time, and even then the students have a very limited ability to apply it. They might kind of get it, but when they start to apply it, it starts to break down because there's so many different nuances to the model, and I have my own particular version of this. But anyway, and I graphically depict this on the whiteboard, so it needs a lot of visual aid. But anyway, so just think of it as your internal, and it's important to recognize you're not only observing the other, which we're more likely to recognize, but we're observing the self. From a very early age, we have the ability to observe the self, or at the very least, subconsciously observe the self. We internalize relationships, not necessarily just other people. And so as we're internalizing the observation of the other and the self, and over time it becomes a very significant part of the personality. Stern parent, rejecting parent, I'm not good enough, I'm unsafe. And there's a lot of other associations. When you actually explore this with people, you get a lot of detail to the way that this plays out. But anyway, so later on in life, we have to deal with this difficult interject in some way. And of course, this isn't some hard science. It's a model of understanding why people do what they do. To me, it very much explains a lot of our weird behavior and our patterns and relationships and our relationship with ourselves, and also provides a model for treatment along these lines. So the interject is playing itself out in our psyche, and we will need to deal with that somehow. And this part of the model requires a lot of explanation, so I'll, for the sake of time, just skip this portion and say that we need some way of dealing with it, and there's a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different explanations as to why and the processes in the psyche that happens and relationally. But just go with me on this, that there's one way that we deal with this internalized relationship by actually recreating it in the external world. We will identify with one side and project the other side onto someone else. And so, for example, with the stern rejecting parent and the I'm not good enough and I'm unsafe internalization, we might recreate that and we will identify with one side or the other. We might identify with the parent and project the observed self onto someone else, or we will identify with the self and we'll project the internalized parent onto someone else, and we'll recreate the relationship subconsciously. We will find someone that is a good candidate for that projective identification, and we will mold and socialize the other person into agreeing or looking even more and more like that original relationship. And the other person is also doing the same thing. And it's not just one interject that we are recreating. It's often a set of interjects that are difficult for us. And also positive. In my model, I actually include positive interjects. It's not usually the case in the literature, but I find that projective identification explains perhaps all relationship aspects, including positive aspects. So if your parents loved you in a certain way and made you feel safe in a certain way, we will also recreate that in a functional, healthy way. But anyway, so it's possible that with Jackie, and of course this is a long stretch, it's possible that for her, the way that I'm depicting that interject, she has a version of or something like that. Of course, I can't know. And she is projecting her vulnerable self onto Marshall, and she's identifying with her parent, internalized parent, and thus tries to play out that relationship over time. She socializes the relationship to look more and more like the relationship was when she was a child. It's also possible that the relationship with Marshall, although on paper and in her mind, she's like, this is a better relationship for me. But because it didn't allow for her to actually involve this projection, it became frustrating to her and it didn't feel right. And thus she broke up with him because she was frustrated in her ability. Because when you have unresolved interjects, there's a large amount of pressure from, in terms of the model, the inside the psyche, to actually get it outside. Because if it resides inside, it creates all these problems of somatization and also self-talk that can be very destructive, or acting out. It's difficult. It's much easier for us, according to the model, to externalize it and play it out outside of ourselves. It's distracting. It gives us the ability to deny that the aspect is actually really part of the self. Anyway, so that could be why the relationship with Marshall played out the way that it did. It also could be why she was attracted to Josh and felt very comfortable with him, because it slotted much more easily into the ability to use projective identification, that she was able to project her stern, unemotional, uncaring person onto Josh, and she was able to identify with the self part of that internalization that felt comfortable with the low self-esteem and the denial of the self and the idea that being sensitive is wrong and deplorable or something like that. I'm making up a lot of stuff, of course, and please don't go to Jackie and say, Dr. Kirk Honda analyzed you, and just, I'm just saying this as a way that you can think about for yourself. And so it does make me wonder about that, given what we're seeing here.
And talk. You're like, I'm leaving.
What else am I supposed to do? What else am I supposed to do? Sit in my feelings and sleep next to someone who said that I was not man enough for them?
I never said you weren't man enough for me. I just said to be more aggressive. We don't have sex, bro. We don't have sex.
And I don't know, this is a long shot, and I don't feel good about even making this speculation really, but in line with the projective identification talk, that it's possible that for Jackie, that statement is related to that theory or that model that I was talking about, where she's looking for aggression. She's used to that. She's trying to recreate that because of the internalized relationship with her parents. And because Marshall doesn't exhibit that, or it's hard to mold him, it's hard to socialize him to agree, and this is all subconscious for the individual engaging in projective identification, that she registers it consciously as a sexual aggression thing, as a manly thing. But deep down, what it is a way of being dominant, or a way of being stern, or a way of being non-emotional, or shaming her for emotions, or something. I don't know. I don't want to put that out there as a solid foundation. But in terms of projective identification, if I were to work with this couple, this would be a line of inquiry that I would go down.
What do you do for me? That is why I'm confused. You have done nothing to make me feel seduced or special or anything. Make me feel like something, Jackie.
I don't make you feel like nothing, so why the fuck are you still with me if I didn't make you feel like nothing?
Because I see you as a project and I saw potential. I thought that you were just gonna come around to me as
And remember, I was talking about mutual projective identification, where both people are engaging in it with multiple types of interjects from their childhood. They're trying to recreate a number of difficult elements that they internalized from relationships in the past. I don't know. We didn't hear much from Marshall in terms of his history. We did hear that he has a lot of pain about his father chastising him about not being good at math. And the way the dad would talk to him was very hurtful. And he described it or depicted it as his dad saying, like, look, if you don't work on this math, if you don't get good at math, then you're going to be homeless and you're going to be begging for money on the street. And when I see that, when you grow up and become a homeless person, I'm not going to stop and help you because you're refusing to, learn math faster or something like that. And then he talked about how because of that, it made him more insecure and more afraid of math and made it harder for him to learn math, which of course is understood by not only good parents and good teachers, but also science. So he was describing that. There's not much to go on there in terms of me hypothesizing, but if we were to go down that line of inquiry and wonder what we might find down there down that path of inquiry with him, then we could hypothesize that so he's being treated in a way that is, you're not good enough, I'm above you, I'm superior, you're a screw up, and he internalizes that of there's a screw up and there's someone saying you're a screw up. You're rejectable. I completely reject you because you can't do this right. And the self is, the internalized self is, I'm ridiculous, I'm stupid, I'm incompetent. Okay, so he has that interject, it's repeated over time, and it becomes a part of himself. And it becomes difficult. He doesn't know what to do with it, so he tries to recreate it. He might find someone like Jackie who is easy to project that self part onto her while he identifies with his dad's self. And he is superior over her, says she's not good enough, says she's a project. I mean, this sounds more and more like it's a possibility. The dad might have even used that word, like, I see your potential. Remember, he uses that word. You're a project to me, but you're incompetent. There's something wrong with you. And I know everything, and you know nothing. And I'm rejecting you emotionally, but I'm staying in contact with you. So who knows, but you could imagine that not only did he sniff her out as a good opportunity for that recreation of one side or the other, but he also tried to massage the relationship into that, and under stress really tried to make it look like that relationship. So that's that mutual projected identification. Both people are doing it to each other subconsciously. We all do this, but the more you are aware of it and the more we heal, the more corrective experiences we have regarding combating those internalizations, the less intense those interjects become and the more positive interjects that we have. For example, for Marshall, I don't know, but if we just take this hypothesis for this fictional person, the awareness of this interject and this propensity for projective identification would help the individual to refrain from it, to notice the impulses. Also, with corrective experiences, perhaps in therapy, if I were to work with someone like this, I would really try to recreate a situation where the client feels like I have the ability to comment on their competence. Not like math or something like this, but it's common for clients to come in and talk about their week, talk about their stresses, talk about their ups and downs. And if I give off a very fatherly vibe to him and tell him that he's good enough, that even in the face of him making a mistake, he might even try to, through transference and through projective identification, try to socialize me to criticize him. He might even go against therapy. He might show up late to therapy, or he might stagnate in therapy as an unconscious way of trying to socialize me to criticize him. And if I'm not aware of my countertransference, then I might give into that transference and have my own countertransference that will play into that interject and will unwittingly actually reinforce that interject that he internalized when he was younger. This is the magic of understanding this process, because when you understand this process, it explains a lot, not only in relationships, but also as a therapist, it explains a lot, because each client brings a different projective identification to the therapy room, particularly as the relationship intensifies. Also, I have my interjects from my life that I will involve with my clients. So that's another part. Also, we will do this to our children. Whatever relationships we went through as children, we will often use projective identification with our own children. Anyway, so the corrective experience would be that in that socialization, in that temptation, in that provocation to me to agree with the rejecting parent who is superior and codependent and looking down on him and rejecting him, commenting on him like, oh, I don't think you're doing that right, I would notice that urge, and more often than not, hopefully, I would do something different other than what he's expecting, other than what he's actually worrying that I will do to him unconsciously. And I will accept him, and I will praise him, and I will comment on him. At the very least, I won't be negative towards him. I won't be superior over him. I might even, reconfigure the relationship in those moments so that he's above me. And so I would be avoiding even just that superiority aspect that he exhibits, and I believe his dad did to him as well. So it's complicated. It's a very complicated process. It's not a hard science. It's really hard to navigate. in the midst, you don't usually have time as a therapist to like stop the session and like contemplate. You have to think on the fly. So it's a matter of experience and a matter of reflection and consultation and education and therapeutic wisdom, professional wisdom over time. And not every therapist operates the way that I do. Of course, I would say I'm kind of in the minority these days. But anyway, so that's the corrective experience. And with that repeated over time, the interject that is frustrating and difficult and negative in the individual becomes lesser and lesser significant, and a different interject that is probably also there of a healthy interaction with someone who can comment on his competence becomes more positive, and thus when he engages in relationships, he's less likely to be attracted to someone that would be a project, and he would also be less likely to socialize them into being a project and seeing them as a project.
Hello, hello.
How are you? You got me flowers.
Flowers, I
So
got.
sweet. Oh my gosh, that's so nice.
Okay, so let's really look at what she says here in this meeting and with the breakup with Josh to see if there is a possibility that Netflix did in fact edit it to make it look like this happened before she broke up with Marshall.
How I felt.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to Josh since Chelsea's party. That was the first time seeing him physically, and
Okay, this isn't related to the matter at hand, but we did hear her say, I haven't talked to Josh since I saw him at the party. I think indicating that they haven't been texting and communicating. So, but they did edit that. It is notable that they didn't just allow the sentence to happen without an edit.
I should have told you how I felt.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to Josh since Chelsea's party.
You see that? It's hard to know. She says, I haven't talked to Josh, cut, since Chelsea's party. Why would you edit it that way? Was it because she said something in between there that they didn't want to end the show? Is it because there was a long pause or a tangent that she went down that they cut out for the sake of time? It's just hard to know. There's just no way to know. Maybe those two phrases were in completely different places. It's just, it does throw a lot of things into question, and I wonder if we'll see that as she mentions in this meeting that she hasn't told Marshall yet about Josh.
But I knew what I had to say.
Yeah.
And I was nervous. Everything had been like weighing on me since the pods. I'm losing a girl that I want to be with, and I don't know how to say that. I was always taught like through competing, through.
And to further the projective identification talk, it's possible that Josh went through experiences where he was dominated physically and verbally and in a lot of ways. And I don't, of course, know that. There's no evidence of that. There's some circumstantial evidence of it. But it's possible that he did and internalized that. So he internalized a weak, dominated self and the dominating, aggressive other. It becomes, over time, a very solid part of his personality. And then he proceeds to recreate that relationship and various relationships, like his relationship with Marshall. When he was intoxicated and at the party, he was engaging in a particular kind of interaction with Marshall, right? And that's another actual part of this, is that not only as a therapist, but even just as a friend or a partner or a family member, if frequently in an interaction with an individual, you feel a certain way, particularly if it's a negative feeling, like you feel belittled, you feel scared, you feel incompetent, only around this person or frequently around this person in a way that you don't normally feel. You know, if you had an ongoing feeling of incompetence, then that more likely is some stable part of your own internalizations. But if you don't usually feel that, but you feel that around a particular person, it's possible that what they're doing is they are actually recreating subconsciously this interject with you, and they're making you feel like either the way they felt when they were young or the way that they perceived their parent to be when they were young. So as a therapist, this is very helpful because I might see a bunch of clients throughout the day, and if every client I feel different about, there's a different vibe, there's a different way I feel about myself, it is potentially, it's hard to know, but it is potentially an indication of the projective identification process that is happening subconsciously. The client is actually socializing me subtly to feel like either the way they felt when they were young or the way that their parent felt when they were perceiving their parent. So, for example, if I feel as a therapist like I'm incompetent as a therapist, like I don't know what I'm doing, and I start questioning myself and feeling insecure, then maybe it's possible that the client was made to feel that way as a child, and they are recreating that relationship through our relationship. And they are identifying with the parent who was belittling, and they are projecting into me that feeling of incompetence. And if I note that, and it gives me an opportunity to wonder and to develop hypotheses of, oh, is projective identification happening right now? Or are my own issues emerging right now that really have nothing to do with the client? It gets complicated, of course. Do I have indigestion? And that's all. Am I screwing up objectively and has nothing to do with either of our past lives, our past relationships? So, it gets complicated, and you have to do all this on the fly and also in your own therapy and in consultation as a therapist and contemplation. So it provides an opportunity. And when I feel it in a particular way, so there are certain interjects that get played out in therapy a lot. There's a theme. There are certain themes to interjects. I won't list them all. There's probably 10 that are really common in therapy, and I will feel a very, when you do this enough as a therapist or just as a person noting this in life, you start to notice, oh, I know that feeling. I know what's happening right now, or at least I suspect it's a familiar feeling. And then very quickly, because you're experienced in this, you don't have to sit down for hours and hours and contemplate, because you've done that already, and you have enough awareness that in the moment as a therapist, it's like, oh, I know that feeling. I know how that feels in my chest. I know the thoughts that start running through my mind. I've already been down this road. And you very quickly start to develop some hypotheses and start testing them out. Usually it's just a matter of time and a matter of exploration, a matter of me asking them about their own childhood, asking them the way they feel about other people, the way they feel about me. So it's complicated, but it's possible that Josh also brings his projective identification to the table as well.
Marshall is too sensitive for me, basically. That was the first time I ever had somebody like love me and like show me and really like translate that to me. I never had that before. I wanted to keep that.
It's interesting. I don't remember her saying that. She's saying something negative and positive. He's too sensitive for me. Also, Marshall is the first person who's ever loved me and I think treated me well. Let's re-listen.
Yeah. So Marshall is too sensitive for me, basically. That was the first time I ever had somebody like love me and like show me and really like translate that to me. I
never had that before. Okay, so she's saying something positive. It's hard to know why, if she feels this way, why she would reject that. Or does she see this as a negative? It just sounds interesting that she's, for the very first time, someone loved me and showed me that, and I don't want to be with that.
I never had that before. I wanted to keep that. And when I had told him to, be a more aggressive and boss up, he left for like 3 days. He just completely
He did the opposite.
He did he just got up and left. And I was like, I stayed, and then.
Oh, I think I missed that. It's so weird. I won't go on a long jag on this, but there's this whole field of phenomenological listening and phenomenological philosophy that I won't bore you with the details. But one of the phenomena within this field of therapy and understanding of philosophy is that as we are listening to people describing, this is of course very important for therapists to understand. Carl Rogers talked a lot about this. That as we're listening to people describe their experience or talk about their day, we're typically bouncing in between listening to them and evaluating and being distracted and filtering it through our own understanding. People do this all the time. If you've ever been in a fight with your partner and you're like, I didn't say that. I never said anything like that. But the other person absolutely believes you did say factually this, and this. And it's because we don't actually record in our memory words in verbatim, we cobble together an understanding of what happened, and it's not a hard recording like a audio recording or a video recording. So when we're listening, even if we're not in a fight and we're just trying to understand someone, we have a lot of distractions, and our brain can only go so fast, and our memory isn't so great, and we have a lot of biases, we have a lot of lenses that we see the world through, and we will register a story or a narrative or an experience or a memory through all that chaos. Then the way to actually really understand what someone is saying is perhaps to ask them more questions or even record the conversation and re-listen to it. And there is a practice in therapy that therapists will do to actually achieve this, which is, on first pass, when I am listening to someone in person, I'm only registering some of the information, say 30%. Upon each time listening to it, and there's a form of research, of qualitative research called phenomenological research that involves this process, you continually listen or watch the video of someone describing their experience, and each time you listen and each time you watch the video, you see something else. If you've ever watched a video or a movie that you really like or a TV show, and then you rewatch it, you'll be like, oh, I did see that, but I didn't register it the first time because I was distracted by something else or whatever. I was, looking at it through a certain lens. So it's common for this to happen. And I say this because not only for you clinicians out there to be inspired, hopefully, by Carl Rogers and other phenomenological proponents, to do your best to really listen, and also to not assume that your initial impression or idea of what you heard from someone is accurate, and to take the time to really make sure. And so there's that, but also if you're listening to your children or your partner or your family member or your friend or your coworker, to really value that, to truly understand someone, or even just to sufficiently understand someone, we often can't rely on just simple, short conversations with people. You really want to take the time to, one of the best things you can do along these lines is you're having a conversation with your partner. Say it's an important conversation about your goals in life, your hopes and dreams, or a conflict you've had. Maybe your partner's describing to you their complaint about you from a previous, you got in a fight yesterday and they're saying, when you did this. It's really important in those situations in particular to take a beat and slow down and say, like, okay, so what did you go through? Tell me more, like what was going through your mind? How did you perceive me? How did it feel? Because usually we'll hear a very little bit of information and we will completely flip it around in our minds and assume we know what the person is saying based on very little information. Of course, we're defended. There's a lot of filters on that. So it's really important to, we can't move forward, particularly in a conflict, in a marriage, until we understand each other, at least sort of. And often people don't take the time and they think, well, I listened to them and they said this. And then they, as an example of this, I'll have a couple who is going through a fight in session, or they had a fight previous and they bring it in, and I will slow the conversation down. I'll say, okay, so how about you describe to your partner what you went through or what your experience was? They'll do that, and it won't be super long, but it'll be longer than maybe previously discussed. And the partner listening, I will ask, okay, so what did you hear? So this is trying to highlight that. So, tell me what your partner just told you. And the listening partner will repeat a story that is wildly off. It'll just be completely missing the point. It might even just be inserting statements that didn't even exist. And because I'm an impartial third-party listener and I'm not affected as emotionally as the individuals, I have a greater chance of actually holding on to objectivity and retaining what the person is actually trying to tell me, right? Because they're not yelling at me. I'm just observing it from the outside. So I will hear something very, very different. And it's almost universal that this happens. And I do this as a way of highlighting. I'll say, well, that's not what I heard, and that's okay. But the way you're characterizing what your partner said is that's not what I heard. I think you might have been listening through a lens. We can talk about that. Maybe there's some legitimacy to that. Maybe I don't understand what's between the lines, but let's go back, and I want you to take a beat and really listen. Take a deep breath and really listen. And then, okay. And then I have the person talking try again. We might rinse and repeat this, go back and forth. Then the other person takes their turn. It sounds like a ridiculous fundamental exercise, but it is needed and it is critical and it is rarely done by people. And so many relationships come to an end literally just because of this problem. People just don't understand. They just don't even know to look at this. They don't know that this is the problem, right? Because think about all the times that you feel like your partner doesn't understand you. You're trying to explain something to them and they just don't get it, or they don't indicate that they get it. They just completely miss the point. And when that happens, then they're more likely to get hurt and upset and angry and distance themselves from you. And then you rinse and repeat that and the relationship is over, right?
You leave.
You shouldn't have said yes to Marshall. How do you think Marshall would feel?
I don't care.
Does he know?
Okay, so this is the critical moment. We hear him say, how do you think Marshall would feel? We hear her say and see her say, I don't care. There's a possibility that they spliced in him saying, how do you think Marshall would feel? That's from a separate part of the conversation. Because it's notable that sometimes there's a two-shot. He says something, she says something, he says something. They could have edited that. There are ways of trying to massage that to make it look the same, but it would be hard and it would probably be detectable. You'd see it'll break or something. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, of course, with deep fakes. It's all over now, but the chance of and the likelihood that they would edit it that way, because my impression is they have at least 3 cameras. They have a camera for the two-shot, they have a camera on her, and they have a camera on him. And they do that for coverage. They do that so that they can edit later for time's sake, because if they just had one camera, it would look weird if they just suddenly cut, right? They want it to look natural, like it's happening in real time. It resonates more if that's the case. And of course, they don't want to just show the entire conversation because it could have been 45 minutes of them talking. That would be too boring. So they have all those cameras, and I just want to point out that we hear him say a question, but we see her respond. And why didn't they use a two-shot? If those things happen sequentially, why did they use a two-shot? Now, sometimes they will edit things that way because they're trying to vary the look. It's more visually interesting if they have the different cuts. Maybe there was too long of a pause there of her answering, or she said and they cut that out. It's hard to know, but it is something to note as a way of trying to prove or disprove her statement that they edited this.
You leave.
You shouldn't have said yes to Marshall. How do you think Marshall would feel?
I don't care.
So you see that? Now, she didn't refute that, so maybe that did happen, at least in essence, the way that it did. But just in terms of having a critical mind, and it's possible that given all the edits, we won't know if Jackie is right or wrong because there's no data to refute or to confirm what she's saying.
Does he know that you and I are talking at all?
Wow. Wait, 1, it's edited. 2, she doesn't verbally say anything. She just shakes her head. Let's rewatch that.
How do you think Marshall would feel?
I don't care.
Does he know that you and I are talking at all?
I robbed myself.
Yeah. Who knows? Could have been edited. It could have been edited. She could have literally said, he says, does he know you're here? She could have said something like, well, no, he doesn't know that I'm here, but I broke up with him last week. Or I broke up with him earlier today, or I broke up with him yesterday. And then that face that she had could have been from a completely different part of the conversation. We can't tell. We might be biased, right? Particularly if you don't like Jackie because of things that are factual, and you are biased, you might look at that and say like, well, it probably is true. We can't know that. As a scientist myself in psychology, we have to return to the data and we have to put aside, and that is also a part of phenomenological listening, is we have to look at our bias and our assumptions and do our best to bracket them, meaning we put some brackets around them and put them on the shelf and then really try to be open to the data. Good science is done this way, where you try to put aside your bias. So from what we just saw, it could have been edited. It could have been drastically edited, and there'd be no way to know. It also could be an exact representation of what happened. It's likely they shaved a little bit off because her facial expressions seemed to happen pretty quick, but who knows? It could have literally happened exactly like that, where they just had the 3 camera shots and they just shifted to different cameras within that time span. And there's nothing that was, if we saw a 2-shot, it would have looked exactly the same. But we won't know, and we might not ever know, because usually the producers don't talk to the media. But let's rewatch that.
Does he know that you and I are talking at all?
And it's even more pronounced the second time I watch it. We can see her face in the 2-shot, and then you see her face here, and it's very different. Now, was it a second later, or was it completely disconnected? Rewatch.
Every time to have that feeling. Marshall, I can't love you because I'm attracted to Josh.
All right, so the first time I watched this, I figured she was basing that statement on having seen him at the party and also in the pods, being with him, and also seeing him at the coffee shop. But it's possible that she's saying this before meeting up with Josh and saying, I'm attracted to him. I don't know if things are going to work out, but I'm attracted to him, so I need to break up with you before I meet up with Josh. Who knows?
I just saw Josh.
So again, it's not a 2-shot, it's edited, but let's review what she just said there.
Because I'm attracted to Josh. I just saw Josh.
I just saw Josh. She said that. I forgot that she just literally, I just saw him. So, okay, so it's possible. It is within the realm of possibility that she just saw him at the party, and that sentence was excised from a larger paragraph where she's saying something like, at the party, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I just saw Josh for the first time. Because you notice they clipped it. I just saw Josh, and I edit a lot of audio for this podcast, and you get to know certain tells of when something, the editor doesn't want to do that. They don't want to just edit a word abruptly like that because it sounds a little odd. If there was a pause after that, they would have put that in there. But so who knows? It could have just been edited for time's sake or for continuity, and this is all representative of reality. But, it is heavily edited.
Because I'm attracted to Josh. I just saw Josh.
So I don't know, fellow editors out there, tell me if I'm wrong. Do you hear that? It probably is because she said something really quickly, or he did, or something. I just saw Josh at the party. It's possible. It's just hard to tell. When they have the opportunity to use a 2-shot or to edit less, they usually will do this on the show. Now, it could be that in intense conversations like this, often there will be long pauses of silence, like maybe even a couple minutes while they're just looking down at the ground or staring at each other. Obviously, that would be cut for time, but it does raise the possibility that this was edited. But I don't know, maybe the statement will come up where she says, because he asks her and she says yes, and maybe that will not indicate edits, but let's watch.
And there is some chemistry.
Again, it does lend itself towards the idea that the edit is true, that she met up with him, she's informing him, there is chemistry, or she's saying that in the midst of a larger paragraph, how she's talking about there's chemistry in the pods, and then I had chemistry while I talked with him a lot at the party.
So what was the talk about?
It was him basically confessing his feelings.
Okay, again, if you don't like her, then you're going to look at it, you're likely to be biased and say, when he says that, what did you talk about? we all think she's referring to the meeting in the coffee shop. It's possible he's referring to the party because Jackie and Josh did talk for a long time at the party. And we only saw an edited version, of course, of their conversation at the party. So he might have confessed his feelings at the party, and he did do that a little bit. I'm going to take a guess and say that some of you are screaming at me and saying, like, no, how can you support this horrible human being to propose that she might be telling you the truth, that this happened before she met up with Josh? Is to support a gaslighter, to support abusive, immoral behavior. And that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm reviewing the facts, I'm reviewing the data. And maybe there's more data that will come out after this that you know about and will push this in one direction or the other. But I'm just reviewing the facts. And the facts are that it could be true that this meeting, this breakup happened before the meeting with Josh. If he came forward and said, no, they edited that. What she said was that she told me she broke up with him the day before, and they cut that out. All right, well, apparently I have a lot to say, more than I thought. I'm trying to be as fast as I can because, well, one, I want to get to tomorrow and actually watch the weddings. So, but yeah, so I hope this isn't too boring. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.